Africa is a continent rich in history, with numerous ancient civilizations and unique natural resources. However, despite this, it faces serious challenges that hinder its development and prosperity. Why does Africa remain poor to this day? The majestic pyramids of Egypt, the ancient city of Carthage, the Bandiagara Escarpment, Victoria Falls, and the Dalo volcano are just a few of the incredible landmarks that remind us of the continent's greatness and potential. On the other hand, we also see images of starving African children. Over time, it's not Africa's wonders that come to the forefront, but various tyrants like cannibal Emperor Bokassa or events like the Rwandan genocide. Most people's perceptions of Africa are a mix of fragmented news reports, poor geography lessons, and wild stories from the tabloid press. As a result, the entire continent is often seen as a chaotic mix of civil wars, starving children, military coups, epidemics, and even cannibalism. While these issues do exist, they aren't happening everywhere and all the time. What prevented the nations of the Black Continent from developing to the level of other continents? Some might say the dry climate and isolation from the rest of the world. Others argue that when survival is easier, there's less motivation to drive progress. And some point to slavery and external influence. In this discussion, we'll try to answer the eternal question, why is Africa still poor? It's no secret that Africa is rich in natural land and human resources. The continent contains vast deposits of minerals like manganese, bauxite, chromite, fuel resources, cobalt and copper ores, gold, platinum, diamonds, phosphates, uranium, and many other valuable resources. Countries like Nigeria, Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and others are among the world leaders in mining precious metals, oil, and gas. Africa's total area is almost 30 million square kilometers. Despite its many deserts and semi-deserts, its arable land covers 9 million square kilometers, slightly larger than the total area of Brazil. Agriculture is the backbone of most African countries' economies. Theoretically, with such resources, African countries could become some of the richest regions in the world. We're talking, of course, about so-called sub-Saharan Africa, not the northern part, which is part of the Mediterranean region where the great civilization of ancient Egypt emerged in antiquity, and where one of the greatest Phoenician colonies, Carthage, was located. Africa's civilizational lag is often exaggerated when considering the continent's overall history. At certain stages of history, Africans were not only keeping pace but also surpassing Europeans in some areas. For instance, Africa never had a Bronze Age. There simply wasn't enough material to produce bronze, so they transitioned directly from the Stone Age to the Iron Age. There were several highly developed states in Africa during the medieval period, which were not much different from European ones in terms of socio-economic development. A prime example is the Mali Empire, which later became the Songhai Empire, lasting from the 13th to the 16th centuries. In southern Africa, the Monomotapa Empire thrived from the 15th to the 18th century. As early as the 10th century, Arab merchant travelers wrote about a prosperous, gold-rich state in the southern part of the continent. Another example is Ethiopia, formerly known as the Kingdom of Aksum, one of the first Christian states in history. These are just a few examples, but they illustrate that the idea of a chronically backward Africa is a stereotype. Different peoples began their histories in various geographic conditions. Geography in its broadest and narrowest sense, climate, the availability of domesticable plants and animals, access to rivers, and more shapes human society, not any notion of exceptionalism. Cultural and psychological traits of peoples are formed by these fundamental factors, most of which are beyond human control. But what ultimately pulled Africa into its current state? Colonization. The development of African states was severely undermined by contact with civilized Europeans, who over several centuries turned the continent into a source of cheap resources and slave labor. Eventually, the entire African continent was carved up by the leading powers of the Old World. For centuries, colonial oppression weighed heavily on Africa, driving the continent further into underdevelopment, effectively keeping local societies at a level of tribal organization rather than even reaching feudalism. It all began in the late 19th century for several reasons. Europe had discovered the properties of quinine, produced from the bark of the South American cinchona tree, which could treat malaria. This made the disease less of a threat to European settlers. Europe also developed rifled firearms, which had significant advantages over the smoothbore muskets used by even the most advanced African armies. Additionally, European explorers had gathered enough information about Africa's interior, debunking the myths of jungles, swamps, and deserts being impassable, or the sun burning people alive, as ancient authors had claimed. Finally, Europe had undergone the Industrial Revolution and desperately needed new markets for the factory goods being produced at unprecedented speed and in large volumes. All that was needed to start the colonial race was the first shot. Surprisingly, it wasn't one of the great powers that fired it, but tiny Belgium. The shot rang out in Brussels in 1876, when King Leopold II announced the creation of the International African Association, supposedly to promote scientific and humanitarian projects in the Congo River Basin. Across Europe, this was understood as Belgium's move to conquer Central Africa, and that's exactly what it was. Belgium's exploitation of the local population on rubber plantations, mines, and road construction projects was unparalleled in its cruelty. Tens of thousands died with repression and looting going unchecked. As the Free State of Congo, a name dripping with irony, wasn't managed by the Belgian government, but was the personal property of Leopold II. Following Belgium's lead were England, France, Portugal, and Spain. Soon after, new powers like Germany and Italy, eager for colonial empires of their own, joined the scramble for Africa. The race gained tremendous speed. Wherever Europeans could strike deals with tribal chiefs or crush local resistance, they planted their flags, and the territory was considered part of the empire. The colonization of Africa wasn't without cost for the colonizers. The British had to endure several bloody battles to capture the Ashanti Confederation in Ghana and the Zulu Kingdom in South Africa. The French faced fierce resistance from the Fulani Emirates and Tuareg tribes in Malay. In Namibia, it took German troops 2 years to suppress the Herero uprising, which ended in a large-scale genocide. So over 3 centuries of the slave trade, Europeans inflicted massive damage on Africa. Millions of Africans were transported to work on plantations in the Americas or died during capture and transit. The likelihood of European colonization of a region increased if the native population could be weakened by alcohol. European colonizers brought alcohol, which was highly profitable, with profits ranging from 400% to 900%. It was traded with the New World in exchange for everything from timber to slaves. In West Africa, alcohol, especially rum, became an integral part of the Golden Triangle, a trade scheme involving rum from America, slaves from Africa, and sugarcane from the West Indies. By 1900, the African continent resembled a patchwork quilt, colored by the flags of European empires. Yet, it wasn't until 1907 that Germany fully subdued Tanganyika, Tanzania, and France secured control over West Africa only by 1913. Libya's tribes continued their resistance against Italian colonization until 1922, and it took the Spanish until 1926 to subdue the Berbers of Morocco. Only one African state, Ethiopia, managed to retain its independence. In the late 19th century, Ethiopia's ruler, Emperor Menelik II, even managed to participate in the division of Africa, expanding his country's borders by more than double through conquests of various tribes to the south, west, and east. Colonizers did build some elements of a modern economy in Africa, though it was minuscule compared to the scale of traditional subsistence farming. They ended tribal wars, abolished cannibalism in Central Africa, opened some schools and hospitals, and educated a few Africans at universities. However, they did not turn the population of the colonies into independent, civilized people. Africans were taught to obey white masters, but this did not make them civilized, nor did it turn former slaves into free men. By the end of the colonial period, the number of educated people and skilled professionals in Africa was extremely small. Most importantly, neither the elites nor the masses were accustomed to making decisions, calculating the consequences, and taking responsibility for them. By the mid-20th century, Africa remained a continent with one of the most politically limited maps. Two colors dominated 60% of the continent: purple, marking France's colonial possessions, and green, representing regions under British control. The process of decolonization, which began after World War II, wasn't without difficulties. Old European powers relinquished only those lands they clearly could not hold on to. Britain could no longer suppress the Indian independence movement, and France could no longer dominate Indochina. However, London and Paris believed they had the resources to prolong their stay in Africa. At the very least, they could leave to stay by replacing direct colonial rule with indirect forms of control over the economy and politics of the new states. This confidence was first shaken by the Soviet Union. Decolonization aligned with Soviet interests as it fractured the unity of the capitalist camp and opened up a socialist path for African nations. In the 1956 Suez Crisis, European colonial empires tried to force the Egyptian government under Gamal Abdel Nasser to abandon the nationalization of the Suez Corridor, launching a war against Egypt with the support of Israel. However, their initial military successes were quickly halted. In an official statement, Moscow condemned the aggression and threatened the British and French with severe consequences, including direct military assistance to Cairo. London and Paris had to retreat, and the world realized that the might of European empires was a thing of the past. Across the African continent, the liberation movement was gaining momentum with active support from Moscow. In the late 1950s, Morocco and Tunisia gained independence from France, quickly establishing diplomatic relations with the USSR. Thanks to Soviet assistance, 1960 became known as the Year of Africa, with 17 African countries achieving independence from their colonial rulers. That same year, at the initiative of the Soviet Union, the United Nations General Assembly adopted the Declaration on the Granting of Independence to Colonial Countries and Peoples. The declaration was approved by an overwhelming majority with 9 abstentions, including the colonial powers and the United States. The USSR invested billions of dollars in supporting African countries in their struggle for independence and in choosing a socialist path of development. It also supplied the continent with vast amounts of weaponry. For instance, the Somali army had tanks, bombers, and fighter jets. Outdated Soviet equipment was replaced with newer technology, and in exchange for loans, equipment, and arms, Moscow received raw materials, various goods, natural rubber, bauxite, iron and steel products, cotton, wool, leather, tea, cocoa beans, textiles, and sugar flowed from African nations to the Soviet Union. The dissolution of the USSR in 1991 marked the beginning of profound transformations in the global balance of power, which naturally affected the African continent. This opened the door to a new phase of competition for Africa. The main contender for Africa's inheritance turned out to be the United States. U.S. financial aid was often tied to strict conditions, such as governments adhering to democratic principles, ensuring free elections that guaranteed changes in leadership, fighting corruption, respecting human rights, promoting press freedom, gender equality, and tolerance. Did this approach work? In most cases, no. One of the few relatively successful examples is South Africa. In contrast, China and India, two countries with significant and growing influence in Africa today, have adopted a different model for strengthening their presence on the continent, which the media sometimes refers to as Asian soft power. Offering large-scale projects to African countries, they avoid imposing strict political conditions and prefer not to interfere in the internal affairs of these nations. They do not prioritize issues like freedom of speech or press freedom, nor do they demand free and fair elections. And without such additional demands, India and China provide substantial financial and technological assistance to African states, allowing them to achieve their strategic goals of deeper penetration into Africa more successfully. China, in particular, collaborates with unstable African nations under various political regimes and is even willing to compromise its political principles. For example, China recently began providing aid to Burkina Faso, despite the fact that this country recognizes Taiwan's sovereignty. In other words, China is subtly absorbing Africa. While the influence of foreign powers in Africa is evident, it's essential to recognize that the continent began to decline long before colonization. As mentioned earlier, Africa once had thriving states. Where did they go? One such example lies hidden in the dense mangroves near the Kenyan coast, the ruins of the ancient city of Giti. This city, part of the Swahili civilization, flourished from the 13th to the 17th century but was suddenly abandoned, leaving more questions than answers. Archaeological findings show that Giti was far from a simple settlement. It had a complex sewage system, evidence of advanced urban planning, as well as mosques, palaces, and even coral stone houses. Giti was actively involved in maritime trade. The city exported jewels, fabrics, spices, and even Chinese porcelain. The local markets bustled with merchants, and ships arrived from the east, bringing exotic goods and cultures. However, despite its prosperity, Giti was abruptly and entirely deserted in the late 17th century. Its streets that were once bustling with people became empty. The reason for this sudden abandonment remains unknown, but archaeologists believe it may have been due to changes in trade routes or coastal droughts, making the area uninhabitable. The favorable African climate is often overestimated. We tend to view Africa as a single unified whole, but in reality, its climate varies significantly from region to region. A striking example of this is the Sahara. The Sahara Desert is not just an ocean of sand, it's a logistical black hole. Traveling across the Sahara has always been a treacherous undertaking, which seriously hindered both trade between Africa and the rest of the world and migration. Where there is no bustling migration and trade, there is little exchange of technology and culture. Even outside the Sahara, conditions in Africa are not much better. The western coast has an oceanic desert climate, the center is continental and semi-arid, and the east experiences a maritime trade wind climate. Thus, even the most favorable regions of Africa are dry and extremely challenging for agriculture. Today, many people fail to realize just how deeply intertwined Europe and Asia have been culturally and technologically since ancient times. The vast network of trade routes known as the Silk Road played a significant role in mutual development. In contrast, habitable Africa was, for a long time, almost entirely isolated from the rest of the world. Society is not defined solely by wealth and material goods. Around Lake Chad, the Kanem-Bornu Empire once thrived. The rulers of this empire actively supported education and had access to unique libraries specializing in Islamic and scientific texts. In one oasis, there was even a printing center where scholars and theologians from across the Muslim world gathered. Despite its remote location, this center helped spread knowledge and preserved intellectual traditions in the region. But like many other states, Kanem-Bornu was eventually destroyed. The empire suffered from internal disagreements and conflicts between various ethnic and tribal groups, and also faced attacks from neighboring states and tribes. In the 16th century, for example, the Safavid dynasty from Persia attempted to extend its influence into Africa. By the 18th century, the empire faced pressure from the Fulani, who conducted armed jihad in an effort to spread Islam throughout the region. The final blow to the empire came with the colonization of Africa. Kanem-Bornu lasted from the 9th to the 19th century, and its collapse symbolizes the fading of cultural heritage and traditions on the continent, which are essential for the cohesion of any society. The empire wasn't immune to epidemics and deadly animals either. Nowhere else on Earth will you find as many living organisms trying to kill you as you will in Africa. Perhaps only Australia rivals Africa in the sheer variety of dangerous creatures found in unexpected places, but that's another story. Throughout history, the demographic stability of Africa has been consistently undermined by various epidemics. The Chet's fly had a profound impact not only on human health, but also on agriculture and livestock development. The sleeping sickness it spread limited the use of livestock as labor, significantly slowing the development of farming and transportation infrastructure. Studies have shown that due to the disease, tropical forests and savannas inhabited by tsetse flies remain sparsely populated, hindering the creation of large state formations and long-term trade routes in these regions. Epidemics, of course, have happened everywhere, but in Africa they remain a chronic issue even today. And let's not forget the snakes, malaria-carrying mosquitoes, black mambas, Nile crocodiles, fat-tailed scorpions, and many other fascinating creatures that are not particularly fond of humans. But even before malaria became a significant problem, Africans unleashed something else in the jungles. This discovery almost knocked malaria off its pedestal and went down in history as one of the most terrifying ways to die. Ships arriving in the New World sometimes raised a yellow flag with a skull and crossbones, and no one dared to board, no matter how valuable the cargo was. The disease wiped out entire cities, fueling many chilling legends about vanished colonies, the vengeance of African slaves, and their curse gods Yellow Jack, Bronze John, Bloody Vomit, or simply yellow fever, a viral hemorrhagic disease of the New World. Yellow fever spread far and wide, predominantly affecting the poorest regions. Europeans only developed a vaccine in 1937, thanks in no small part to the Rockefeller Foundation, which allocated vast sums to fight the disease. But even then, the problem wasn't solved outside domestic territories, and it remains a danger in Africa today. In the same category are diseases like Ebola, Lassa fever, Marburg virus, and West Nile virus. This complex set of causes, from climate to foreign intervention, continues to prevent African nations from standing alongside the world's largest powers. It's worth noting that from time to time someone tries to unite African countries without foreign interference. One such person was Muammar Gaddafi, but we all know how his attempt to create the African Union ended, so it remains to be seen whether the African continent will finally find its own successful path to development. But if you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and subscribe. See you in the next one.